Welcome to the Echoes of Ihsan podcast. We're doing a deep dive, into the world of Islamic finance, specifically a concept called Qirad. And we're going to be taking most of our material from the Muwatta Imam Malik book 32, which just has some incredibly insightful perspectives on ethical investing and economic practices from early Islamic history.
Right.
And I think what you and I both found really interesting when we were reading this is it's not just kind of dry rules. There are a lot of real historical examples that the Muwatta brings up that kind of illustrates how this stuff works.
Yeah.
And one of those that really stood out to me was about Abdullah and Ubaidullah,
Right.
the sons of the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good one and a very well-known story in Islamic history. And it really does illustrate not only the mechanics of Qirad, but also the ethical considerations that are really deeply embedded in Islamic finance.
Yeah. So do you want to tell that story?
Yeah.
Because I think it's a really good one.
Sure. Abdullah and Ubaidullah. So these are two sons of Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was the caliph at the time. They were coming back from a military campaign in Iraq, and they stopped in Basra. And the governor there, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, offered them a Qirad arrangement. He said, I've got all the state money. Why don't you take it and go buy some goods in Iraq and then come back to Medina and sell them.
Make a profit.
And make a profit, right. So, on the face of it, it seemed like a, pretty savvy business proposition, right? I mean, they were there. The trade rights already existed, from Iraq back to Medina. So it's not like they were, blazing a trail.
Yeah.
This was a well-trodden path. So they took the money, they went and bought goods, came back to Medina, presented the profits to their father. And Umar, being a very wise and just ruler, said, well, was this offered to everyone or just to you?
And I'm guessing the answer was just to them.
Yeah. It turns out that it was an exclusive offer that was only made to the Caliph's sons.
And I bet Umar wasn't very happy about that.
No, he was not. And he insisted that they return not only the principal, but also the entire profit.
Wow.
His reasoning was that any gain that resulted from their familial connection, rather than, their business acumen, was not truly earned.
Yeah.
It was, it was based on something that was unfair.
Yeah, it was almost like an insider trading kind of thing.
Yeah. Like, why did they get this offer and no one else got this offer?
Right.
Well, it's because they're the Caliph's sons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's such a powerful statement. It's like avoiding even the hint of impropriety. And that it wasn't just that they got this offer that was a problem. It was that they profited from it. And that profit wasn't actually truly theirs.
Right. And it speaks to a very core principle of Islamic finance, which is that of transparency and equitable dealings.
Right.
No one should be profiting unjustly from their position or their relationships or anything like that.
And, this really sets the stage for understanding the rest of what's in the Muwatta about Qirad. Because it's not just historical anecdotes, It goes on to actually talk about specific regulations and guidelines that govern these kinds of partnerships. And that's really what makes this different than just any, basic loan agreement. This is much more nuanced. So what kinds of guidelines are we talking about here? What were some of the practices that were specifically permitted within a Qirad arrangement?
So there's several. I mean, one is that the agent is the person who's receiving the capital. They're allowed to use a portion of the funds for necessary expenses for their business travel.
Okay.
So, let's say you're, back then you're going on a caravan. To acquire, rare spices or something, you need, provisions. You need to eat on the way. You need a place to stay. So they're allowed to use some of the Qirad capital for this purpose.
So it's not like the entire amount just has to be used to buy goods. There's a recognition that there are other costs associated with that.
Right.
What else was permitted?
Well, the profit-sharing ratio had to be mutually agreed upon beforehand. So they would say, okay, we're going to split this 50-50 or 60-40 or whatever it is. So it's not like one person is dictating the terms. It's a shared understanding of how the profits will be divided.
So it's like any other business partnership we would see today.
Yeah.
It has to be clear up front what the agreement is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There were also stipulations regarding the types of goods that could be traded, so it might be specified in the agreement that you can only use this money to trade in, cloth or baits or whatever it is.
Right. And I'm guessing that this was heavily influenced by, religious considerations and ethical considerations.
Yeah, that's good.
To avoid engaging in, trade that was deemed harmful or unethical.
So if it was something that was prohibited in Islam, like, alcohol or pork products,
right,
then that would be excluded from a Qirad agreement.
Yeah. So it's interesting that, it wasn't just about making money. It had to be about making money in a way that was aligned with
Yeah.
a broader set of, moral principles.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what was allowed. What about what wasn't allowed? What are some of the things that the Muwatta specifically cautions against?
One of the things they say is that you can't use Qirad to delay debt repayment.
Okay.
So if you owe someone money, you can't just say, hey, let's make this into a Qirad arrangement. And, maybe that way I can put off paying you back.
Right.
The purpose of Qirad is to facilitate trade and investment,
Right.
not to circumvent existing financial obligations.
So it can't be used as like a loophole.
Exactly.
Yeah. To get out of a debt that you already owe.
That's right.
What else?
You also couldn't guarantee profit. So the agent couldn't go to the investor and say, look, I guarantee you're going to make 10% on this.
Right. Because that would be like speculation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which, in Islamic finance is generally prohibited.
It goes against that idea of risk sharing that
Yeah.
we were just talking about.
Yeah. That's right.
Where both parties, are kind of bound to whatever the outcome is.
Yeah.
Whether it's good or bad.
And this is what differentiates it from a fixed term loan, where the lender expects to get their money back, plus a predetermined interest, regardless of what the borrower does.
Right.
So it's a very different concept.
Yeah. And it's interesting how this is centuries ago,
Oh,
but it's still relevant to the kinds of problems that we see in finance today,
absolutely.
where, there's these attempts to, make promises about returns
Mm.
or to, kind of obscure the risk that's involved.
Right.
And that's something that the Muwatta is very clearly against.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about some of the general guidelines, but I think what you and I found really interesting are some of the more complex scenarios that come up.
Yeah.
Where it's not so obvious, what the right course of action is.
That's right.
And so what were some of those that really stood out to you as being kind of those really thought-provoking situations?
Well, one is what happens if the agent spends more than the Qirad capital.
Okay.
So, maybe they underestimate the cost of goods, or maybe there's some unexpected expenses.
Mm-hmm.
So they go over budget.
Right.
So who's responsible for that overspending?
Yeah.
Does the agent have to pay it all back?
Right.
Or is the investor also liable?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I can see how that could lead to arguments
Mm-hmm.
and disputes very easily.
Yeah, and the Muwatta addresses that.
Oh, good.
And then there's the question of losses.
Mm.
What happens if the venture doesn't go as planned?
Right.
Who absorbs the brunt of that loss? Is
Right.
it shared?
Mm-hmm.
Or does it fall on one party or the other?
Yeah, it seems like understanding how those risks are shared
Hmm.
would be crucial for, building trust
Yeah,
and making sure that everything's fair.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you get into even more nuanced questions,
Yeah.
like can the agent use any of the Qirad funds for their own personal needs?
Okay.
Can they give some to charity? If so, what are the limits on that?
Yeah.
What are the conditions?
Yeah. It's like they were trying to anticipate as many possible situations as they could to really make it clear, what the boundaries were.
Yeah.
And how to act ethically.
Yeah, and a lot of the rulings that are given are based on the concept of intent.
Okay.
So it's not just about following the letter of the law. It's
Mhm.
about acting with integrity
Right.
and making sure that your actions are in line with the true spirit of the Qirad partnership.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So,
So instead of giving someone 1,000 dinars, you give them 1,000, measures of wheat or something, 1,000 bolts of cloth or whatever it is.
okay. And the Muwatta is not a fan of that.
No. They generally discourage this practice because it introduces a lot of complexities
Yeah.
and potential for unfair outcomes.
Yeah. So why is that? What are some of the problems with using goods instead of currency?
Well, one is that the value of goods can fluctuate a lot,
Right.
unlike currency,
Yeah.
which, is relatively stable.
Yeah.
The price of goods can go up and down.
Yeah.
Based on, supply and demand or seasonality or even, political events.
Right.
So if you're using goods as the capital,
Hmm.
then the value of that capital might change during the course of the partnership.
Right.
And that makes it really difficult to determine a fair profit-sharing arrangement.
Yeah, that makes sense. So give me an example of how that could go wrong.
So let's say that the investor provides a large quantity of silk as the capital for the Qirad,
Okay.
and then during the partnership, there's a blight that affects silkworms, and the price of silk skyrockets. So now the agent is able to sell that silk at a much higher price than its initial value. And they make a huge profit.
Right.
But the investor only gets a share of the profit.
Yeah.
Based on the initial valuation.
Which is much lower.
Right.
So that doesn't seem very fair to the investor.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And of course, the opposite could happen too. The price of the goods could plummet, and then the investor would be the one who suffers the loss.
Right.
Even though it wasn't their fault.
Yeah. So I can see why the Muwatta is, conscious about this.
Right.
Yeah. And it's interesting how, this connects to some modern debates that we have today about, commodity trading and the ethics of investing in, tangible goods as opposed to currency.
Yeah.
Because you see that same problem where the value can fluctuate so much.
Yeah.
And it's hard to make sure that things are fair.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, so.
Yeah.
Let's go back now to some of those complex scenarios that we were talking about, where we have, the agent may be spending more than the capital,
right,
or there's a loss involved. I want to get into the specifics of how those are actually addressed within this framework of ethical finance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about what happens when the agent spends more than the capital. So, like I said, they may find a really good opportunity and they need more funds to take advantage of it, or maybe the prices go up and they need more capital to buy the same amount of goods.
Right. So what happens then?
So in this case, the Muwatta says that the investor has a choice. They can either accept the goods as they are and reimburse the agent for the extra amount that they spent.
So basically they're buying out the agent's share.
Right, exactly. Or if both parties agree, the investor can become a partner in the venture, proportionate to the additional investment.
So they're basically saying, okay, you put in extra money, I'll match that. And then we'll adjust the profit sharing accordingly.
Exactly. So that's if the venture is successful.
Right. What if it's not?
If there's a loss, then the Muwatta says that the agent is responsible for the entire loss.
Even the part that's beyond the initial investment.
Yes. Even the part that's beyond the initial investment.
So the investor is protected.
The investor is protected.
Okay. That's interesting. It seems like the agent is kind of getting penalized for taking initiative.
Well, I mean, you have to remember that the agent acted independently by going over the agreed upon capital. So in a way, they embarked on a separate venture,
right,
alongside the original Qirad agreement,
without getting permission first.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not so much about punishing them; it's more about
protecting the investor,
and
the sanctity of the original agreement.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense.
So really, it highlights the importance of communication. If the agent needs to go over budget, they need to talk to the investor, get their consent, and maybe even renegotiate the terms.
Yeah, to reflect that additional risk. Yeah. Okay, so another complex scenario that I wanted to ask you about is, what about using Qirad funds for personal needs?
Yeah.
Like specifically charity.
Yeah.
Can the agent do that?
So this is an interesting question. Because on the one hand, charity is a very important part of Islam.
Right.
It's one of the 5 pillars. Muslims are encouraged to give generously. But on the other hand, we're talking about someone else's money here.
Right.
So can the agent just decide to give away the investor's money?
Even if it's for a good cause?
Even if it's for a good cause.
That seems like a tough one.
It is. And the Muwatta is very clear on this.
Okay.
They say that the agent cannot donate any of the Qirad capital to charity without explicit permission from the investor.
Okay. So even if the agent has good intentions,
it doesn't matter.
They can't just do it on their own?
Yeah.
They have to get permission.
They have to get permission.
Okay. And I think that really highlights how Qirad, while it's based on ethical values, it also recognizes that...
there are these practical considerations.
Right.
It's someone else's money.
Right.
You can't just do whatever you want with it.
You have to be responsible.
Exactly.
Yeah. What about if the agent has their own personal needs?
Okay.
Like, let's say they get sick while they're traveling.
Right.
Or there's some kind of emergency.
Yeah.
Can they use the Qirad capital for that?
So the Muwatta does allow for that
Okay.
in cases of hardship.
Okay.
So if the agent is truly in need, they can use a small portion of the capital to meet their needs. They have to reimburse the investor.
As soon as possible.
As soon as possible.
Okay, so it's not like they can just...
take the money and run.
Right, yeah.
They have to pay it back.
Okay. So it's like the system is...
trying to be flexible.
Flexible?
But also fair to both parties.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting how all these rulings, they really seem to be trying to anticipate all the different things that can happen.
Right.
And to make sure that
Things are handled ethically.
ethically. Yeah. It's pretty impressive when you
Yeah.
think about how long ago this was
Yeah.
and how sophisticated
It really is.
it is. It's not just about the money.
No.
It's about the relationship.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
about building trust and
Yes.
acting with integrity.
Yeah. It's really fascinating. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different scenarios here, but there's one more that I think is really important, which is how Qirad handles debt and loss,
Right.
because those are inevitable parts of any business.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious to know how Qirad deals with those.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So let's talk about those, those really kind of difficult aspects of business,
Yeah.
which are debt and loss.
Yeah.
What happens, if
Mm-hmm.
if things don't go according to plan?
Right.
How does Qirad deal with that?
Yeah. So let's start with debt. What happens if the agent takes on debt during the course of the venture?
Okay.
So let's say they buy some goods on credit
Mm-hmm.
to expand their trading operations.
Right.
Who's responsible for repaying that debt?
That's a good question.
So the Muwatta Imam Malik is very clear on this point. They say that if the agent incurs debt while conducting business within the framework of the Qirad agreement, they are personally liable for settling that debt.
So the investor is off the hook.
The investor is not responsible
Okay.
for any debts that the agent might take on. So their liability is limited to that initial investment.
Right.
Okay, so that seems to make sense. Protects the investor.
Yeah.
But it also encourages the agent to be responsible,
Yeah.
knowing that they're the ones who are ultimately going to have to pay back those debts.
Yeah.
Okay, but what if the debt arises from a loss? So let's say the agent buys some goods,
Yeah.
and then those goods are damaged or stolen, or they lose value for some reason.
Right.
What happens then?
So in that case, the principle of risk sharing kicks in.
Okay.
So just as the investor and the agent share in the profits, they also share in the losses.
Okay.
If there's a loss. That's due to circumstances beyond anyone's control,
Mhm.
like theft or natural disaster.
Or just the market going down.
Exactly.
Yeah. Then that loss is absorbed by both parties,
Proportionally.
according to their agreed-upon profit-sharing ratio.
Okay.
So if they agreed to split the profits 50-50,
Uh-huh.
then they would also split the losses 50-50.
Got it.
And if they had a different ratio, then they would split the losses accordingly.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that seems fair. Because, it's recognizing that these things happen and
Yeah.
you can't always predict.
You can't control everything.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just acknowledging that
And
risk.
sharing it fairly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about situations where the loss is due to the agent's negligence? So let's say they don't take proper care of the goods
Yeah.
and they get damaged or spoiled
Yeah.
or they make some bad decisions
Yeah.
that result in a loss.
So in that case, the Muwatta makes the distinction between losses that are due to external factors and losses that are due to the agent's actions.
Okay.
So if the loss is due to the agent's negligence or misconduct, then they are fully responsible for that loss.
Okay, so that risk-sharing principle doesn't apply in that situation
No.
because it's their fault.
It's their fault.
Okay.
So they have to bear the full financial burden.
Got it.
And this is really important because it incentivizes the agent to act responsibly and ethically,
Right.
knowing that they're going to be held accountable
For their decisions.
for their decisions.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's, it's holding people accountable, but it's also recognizing that sometimes things happen
Right.
that are outside of anyone's control.
Yeah.
So it's about finding that balance.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. I think this has been a really fascinating exploration of Qirad. And it's amazing to me how, these principles that were developed centuries ago are still so relevant today.
Yeah.
And they really make you think about, how we can apply them to the challenges that we're facing
Absolutely.
in modern finance.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we can learn from these ancient models.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Qirad. We hope you found it as interesting as we did and that it's given you some food for thought about how we can create a more ethical and equitable financial system